raid or conquest. They laid the foundations of Russia itself. The geography of Sweden shaped everything that followed. While Norway's fragmented fjords produced independent chieftains and Denmark's flatlands enabled early political unity, Sweden occupied a middle ground. The eastern coastline offered hundreds of islands and protected harbours. Rivers penetrated deep into the interior. Forests covered the landscape, broken by fertile valleys where barley and rye could grow during the short summer. Iron ore lay abundant in the ground. Sweden had resources, timber, furs, iron, but lacked the agricultural surplus of southern lands. The Baltic Sea dominated Swedish consciousness. In winter, it froze solid, allowing travel by sled. In summer, it became a highway. And crucially, rivers flowing eastward from the Baltic connected to other river systems. A determined trader could portage boats between watersheds and reach the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, the great cities of the Islamic world. The people who would become the Swedish Vikings emerged from centuries of cultural development in Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence shows that by the 6th century, communities around Lake Mälaren had developed sophisticated metalworking. Boat-building traditions stretched back generations. Society organised around small farmsteads, each supporting perhaps 10 to 20 people. Extended families worked land that fathers had cleared and grandfathers had farmed. But resources remained limited. When harvests failed, when sons inherited divided properties too small to support families, when ambition outgrew opportunity, young men looked elsewhere. They looked east. The transition from the Vendel period to the Viking Age occurred gradually during the 8th century. There was no single moment when peaceful farmers transformed into raiders and traders. Instead, incremental changes accumulated. Boat designs improved, incorporating stronger keels and more efficient sail plans. Metalworking, techniques advanced, producing better weapons and tools. Trade connections expanded, bringing silver and exotic goods north. Communities around key trading sites like Birka grew larger and more diverse. The chieftains who controlled these sites accumulated unprecedented wealth and power. Gamla Uppsala, the ceremonial centre of the Svea people, hosted elaborate burials featuring weapons, jewellery, and sometimes entire ships. These burial mounds announced status and commanded respect. The families buried there had resources to outfit ships, recruit crews, and sponsor expeditions to distant lands. The Swedish Vikings distinguished themselves from their Scandinavian cousins in several fundamental ways. While Danish and Norwegian raiders could strike England, Ireland, and Francia by relatively short sea voyages, Swedish geography oriented eastward. The Baltic Sea was their Mediterranean. The rivers flowing into it were their highways. But these rivers presented challenges Western Vikings never faced. Portages required crews to carry entire boats and cargo overland. Rapids needed careful navigation. Local populations controlled critical choke points. Success demanded different skills than coastal raiding. Swedish expeditions needed trade goods, diplomatic ability, and the capacity for sustained violence when negotiations failed. They developed all three. The earliest Swedish ventures eastward probably began in the late 8th century, though the evidence remains fragmentary. Swedish traders and warriors appeared along the eastern Baltic coast, establishing seasonal camps and trading relationships with Finnic and Baltic peoples. These early expeditions sought furs, slaves, and access to river routes. The fur trade proved particularly lucrative. Northern forests teemed with animals whose pelts commanded extraordinary prices in southern markets: beaver, marten, sable, ermine. A single high-quality fur could represent months of agricultural labour. Slaves, captured in raids or purchased from local chieftains, provided another valuable commodity. The Arabic term for Slavic peoples and the word slave share the same root, reflecting brutal realities of medieval commerce. By the early 9th century, Swedish expeditions had penetrated far up the river systems of Eastern Europe. The Daugava, Neva, and Volkhov rivers provided routes inland. The real prize lay beyond. The Dnieper and Volga rivers offered access to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. Reaching these required extraordinary effort. Crews dragged boats between river systems, sometimes for miles. They fought or paid off local populations. They endured mosquitoes, disease, harsh weather, and the constant threat of ambush. Yet they persisted, driven by the staggering profits available to those who completed the journey. Silver flowed north from the Islamic world in quantities that transformed Scandinavian society. Thousands of Arabic dirhams have been discovered in Swedish hoards, testimony to successful expeditions. The Swedes who travelled these rivers called themselves the Rus. The name's origin remains debated. Some scholars argue it derives from the Finnish word for Sweden, Ruotsi, itself possibly connected to the Swedish coastal region of Roslagen. Others propose different etymologies. Regardless of linguistic origins, the term distinguished these eastern adventurers from those who remained in Sweden or raided westward. The Rus established permanent settlements at strategic points along the river routes. Staraya Ladoga, at the southern end of Lake Ladoga, became an early centre. Founded around 750, it served as a base for expeditions both north and south. Archaeological excavations reveal a mixed population: Scandinavians, Slavs, and Finns living in close proximity, engaged in craft production and trade. Around 862, according to the Russian primary chronicle, Slavic and Finnic tribes invited the Rus to rule over them. The chronicle states, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Whether this invitation reflected historical reality or later political mythology remains unclear. The chronicle was compiled centuries after the events it describes, during a period when Kievan princes wanted to legitimize their rule. Nevertheless, something significant happened in the mid-9th century. A Rus leader named Rurik established control over Novgorod and the surrounding region. The archaeological and textual evidence, though imperfect, points to substantial Scandinavian involvement in the formation of early Russian political structures. Rurik himself remains a shadowy figure. Byzantine and Arabic sources provide no contemporary confirmation of his existence. Yet later, Russian chronicles present him as the founder of the dynasty that would rule until 1598. His origins probably lay in Sweden, though some scholars argue for Danish or Norwegian ancestry. The questions of where he came from and how he gained power matter less than what followed. Under Rurik and his successors, the Rus transformed from seasonal traders into permanent rulers. They married into local Slavic aristocracy, adopted local languages, and gradually merged Scandinavian military culture with Slavic agricultural communities. This process of integration occurred over generations, creating a hybrid society. Rurik's successor, Oleg, moved south around 882 and seized Kiev, a strategic settlement overlooking the Dnieper River. Kiev offered immense advantages. It controlled river traffic between the Baltic and Black Seas. Rich agricultural lands surrounded it. From Kiev, rulers could dominate trade routes, extract tribute from surrounding peoples, and project power in multiple directions. Oleg declared Kiev the mother of Russian cities. Whether he actually used those words, the choice proved decisive. Kiev became the capital of what historians call Kievan Rus, a political entity that would endure for centuries and shape Eastern European history profoundly. The Kievan state combined Scandinavian military organization with Slavic numerical superiority and agricultural productivity. The ruling elite maintained connections to Scandinavia for generations. They gave their children Scandinavian names, maintained Scandinavian burial customs, and recruited warriors from Sweden. Yet they also adopted Slavic language and customs. By the mid-10th century, the majority of the population spoke Slavic languages. The distinction between Rus and Slav blurred. Intermarriage accelerated cultural fusion. A grandson of Scandinavian warriors might speak only Slavic, worship Slavic gods alongside Norse deities, and identify primarily with Kiev rather than Sweden. The scale of Rus expansion eastward matched anything the Danes and Norwegians achieved westward. By 900, Rus settlements dotted the river routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Trading stations, fortified towns, and tribute-collecting centres formed a network of power. The Rus extracted furs, honey, wax, and slaves from the forested north. They traded these goods south to Constantinople and the Islamic world, receiving silver, silk, spices, and luxury goods in return. The profits were staggering. A successful trading expedition could make a man wealthy for life. A chieftain who controlled a key trading post could outfit armies and build halls that attracted followers. The journey from Kiev to Constantinople tested human endurance. Each spring, merchants assembled boats at Kiev. They waited for the Dnieper to rise with snowmelt. Then they set off downstream, carrying furs, slaves, honey, and wax. The river journey covered nearly 900 kilometres. 7 major rapids interrupted the flow. Each required different techniques to pass. Some could be run with skill and luck. Others demanded that crews unload cargo, drag boats around the obstruction, and reload under threat of attack from Pecheneg raiders who haunted the steppes, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. Porphyrogenitus, writing in the 10th century, described this journey in detail. His account preserves Scandinavian names for the rapids alongside Slavic ones, evidence of the cultural mixing occurring among the Rus. Upon reaching the Black Sea, Rus traders faced another challenge, convincing Byzantine authorities to allow them into Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire viewed these northern barbarians with suspicion and contempt, yet needed their goods and feared their military capacity. Treaties regulated the relationship. The Rus could enter the city only through specific gates. They surrendered weapons before entering. They could remain only 6 months. They received food allowances and bath privileges. Byzantine officials monitored their activities constantly. Yet trade occurred on massive scales. Furs from northern forests clothed Byzantine aristocrats. Slavic slaves staffed Byzantine households. In return, silver and silk flowed north, enriching Rus merchants and Swedish chieftains. Military expeditions accompanied commercial ventures. The Rus attacked Constantinople repeatedly during the 9th and 10th centuries. In 860, 200 Rus ships appeared before the city's walls, while the Byzantine emperor campaigned elsewhere. The attack failed, but terrified Byzantines. In 907, Oleg allegedly led 2,000 ships against Constantinople, forcing a favourable trade agreement. In 941, Prince Igor attacked with a large fleet, but Greek fire, the Byzantines' secret weapon, destroyed many ships. Igor returned in 944 with an even larger force, prompting Byzantines to negotiate rather than fight. These expeditions combined raiding, diplomacy, and trade. Violence and commerce intertwined. A Rus leader might attack one year and trade the next, depending on which promised better returns. Meanwhile, back in Sweden, society was transforming. The wealth flowing north from eastern expeditions concentrated in the hands of successful chieftains. At Birka, on an island in Lake Mälaren, a trading town emerged that rivaled anything in Scandinavia. Founded around 750, Birka became Sweden's window to the wider world. Merchants from the Carolingian Empire, the British Isles, and the Baltic region converged there. Ships arrived carrying glass, wine, textiles, and weapons. They departed loaded with furs, iron, and amber. Archaeological excavations reveal a cosmopolitan community. Christian graves appear alongside pagan burials. Arabic coins mingle with Carolingian silver. Craft workshops produce jewellery, textiles, and metalwork for export. Birka's population probably numbered around 700 to 1,000 permanent residents, with many more during the trading season. The town occupied a strategic location, easily defended and accessible to ships. Earth ramparts protected the settlement. A garrison of warriors maintained order and collected tolls. The Swedish king claimed sovereignty over Birka, but practical power belonged to the local chieftains who controlled trade and commanded armed followers. These men built large halls where they feasted warriors, displayed wealth, and conducted diplomacy. Status derived from generosity as much as martial prowess. A successful chieftain redistributed wealth to maintain loyalty and attract new followers. The religious landscape of Viking Age Sweden mixed indigenous Norse beliefs with increasing Christian influence. At Gamla Uppsala, 3 great burial mounds commemorated legendary kings. Swedish pagans worshipped Odin, Thor, and Frey, at a temple described in later sources as magnificent and terrifying. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, claimed the temple featured gold decorations and hosted sacrifices every 9 years. Each sacrifice supposedly included 9 males of every living creature, including humans. Their bodies hung in a sacred grove visible from afar. Modern archaeology cannot confirm these lurid details, which may reflect Christian propaganda more than pagan reality. Nevertheless, the Uppsala temple represented the ceremonial heart of Swedish paganism. Chieftains travelled there to perform sacrifices, consult priests, and demonstrate piety to the old gods. Yet Christianity was advancing. Ansgar, a Frankish missionary, visited Birka in 829 and again in 852. He established a church and made some converts, though his mission achieved limited success. Swedish pagans saw little reason to abandon gods who had served their ancestors well. The Christian God promised salvation in the afterlife, but Norse gods offered practical benefits. Odin granted victory in battle, Thor protected against chaos, Frey ensured good harvests. Why abandon proven allies for an unfamiliar deity? Moreover, Christianity demanded exclusive worship. Norse religion tolerated multiple gods and flexible beliefs. The exclusivity Christianity demanded seemed strange and unappealing. Trade with Christian Europe gradually shifted attitudes. Merchants discovered that Christian trading partners preferred dealing with fellow Christians. conversion opened commercial opportunities. Some Swedish chieftains accepted baptism for pragmatic reasons, maintaining pagan practices privately while presenting a Christian face publicly. This religious flexibility scandalized Christian observers but made perfect sense within Norse cultural logic. Gods were powerful beings to be respected, not absolute truths demanding exclusive allegiance. Adding the Christian god to one's pantheon seemed prudent, not heretical. Political developments in Kievan Rus accelerated religious change. In 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev converted to Orthodox Christianity and ordered mass baptisms throughout his realm. Vladimir's conversion reflected pragmatic calculation. He sought alliance with the Byzantine Empire, marriage to a Byzantine princess, and the administrative benefits Christianity offered. A unified religion with literate clergy could help govern vast territories. Vladimir's decision profoundly influenced Eastern European history, but it also severed religious connections between Kievan Rus and pagan Sweden. Swedish chieftains who had maintained ties with Kiev faced a choice: convert or accept growing cultural distance from their eastern relatives. The Swedish heartland itself remained politically fragmented throughout the Viking Age. No single king ruled all Sweden. Instead, regional chieftains controlled territories of varying sizes. The Svea dominated the region around Uppsala and Lake Mälaren. The Götar controlled southern Sweden. These groups sometimes cooperated, sometimes competed, occasionally fought wars. The title King of the Swedes existed, but its practical authority remained limited. Kings ruled by consent of powerful chieftains who could withdraw support if dissatisfied. Successful kings demonstrated martial prowess, generosity, and religious piety. They led armies, distributed treasure, and performed sacrifices. Failure brought replacement. One king who achieved lasting fame was Erik the Victorious, who ruled in the late 10th century. Sagas credit him with important victories, though separating historical fact from later embellishment proves difficult. The sagas claim Erik defeated a Danish king at the Battle of Fyrisvellir near Uppsala, securing Swedish independence from Danish domination. Whether this battle occurred as described remains uncertain. Nevertheless, Erik represented a successful Swedish king, militarily competent, religiously orthodox by pagan standards, and capable of maintaining power against rivals. His son Olof Skotkonung would convert to Christianity, marking a watershed in Swedish history. Olof Skotkonung's baptism around 1008 represented royal acknowledgement of Christianity's growing influence. Yet acceptance came slowly and unevenly. Olof himself faced opposition from pagan chieftains who resented his new faith. He established a bishopric at Skara in Västergötland, far from the pagan stronghold at Uppsala. This geographical separation reflected political reality. Christianity gained foothold first in southern and coastal regions, while interior areas remained pagan for decades. The conversion of Sweden occurred over generations, not through a single royal decree. Old gods lingered in popular practice long after official Christianity triumphed. The 11th century witnessed Sweden's gradual integration into Christian Europe's political and cultural framework. Swedish kings sought recognition from the Pope and established relationships with other Christian monarchs. Swedish merchants traded increasingly with Germany and the British Isles. Missionary activity intensified. Bishops arrived from England and Germany to organize Swedish church administration. Monasteries were founded, introducing literacy and new administrative techniques. Churches replaced pagan temples, though often on the same sites. The transition involved negotiation, compromise, and occasional violence. Meanwhile, the connection between Sweden and Kievan Rus persisted but transformed. Scandinavian military recruitment to Kiev declined as the Rus dynasty became thoroughly Slavicized. By 1050, the ruling elite of Kievan Rus spoke Slavic, practiced Orthodox Christianity, and identified culturally with Byzantine civilization more than Scandinavian paganism. The term Rus no longer denoted Swedes abroad, but rather the inhabitants of a distinct Eastern European state. Yet family connections endured. Swedish princesses married into the Rus dynasty. Swedish warriors still sought service with Rus princes. And crucially, the trade routes pioneered by earlier Swedish adventurers continued operating, channeling Eastern silver and luxury goods northward. The Varangian Guard represented the ultimate expression of Swedish military prowess in foreign service. Byzantine emperors, impressed by Scandinavian warriors' fighting ability and relative immunity to local political intrigue, recruited them as elite bodyguards. The Guard formed in the late 10th century and included Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, and Rus. These warriors swore loyalty directly to the emperor, receiving exceptional pay and privileges. They fought in Byzantine campaigns across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Service in the Varangian Guard brought honor and wealth. Warriors who completed their service and returned home became men of substance, able to purchase land and command respect. Runestones across Sweden commemorate men who travelled east. More than 30 stones mention journeys to Greece, meaning Byzantine territory. The Gripsholm runestone records. Tola had this stone raised for her son Harold, brother of Ingvar. They travelled bravely far for gold, and in the east gave food to the eagle. Died in the south in Sörkland. Sörkland meant the lands of the Saracens, the Islamic world. The reference to feeding eagles meant dying in battle, leaving corpses for carrion birds. These terse inscriptions memorialise Swedish participation in Eastern adventures spanning generations. The stones stand as permanent testimony to ambition, courage, loss, and the transformative power of long-distance trade and warfare. The most extensive Eastern expedition occurred around 1041, when Ingvar the far-travelled led a large force down the Volga River toward the Caspian Sea. Approximately 30 runestones commemorate men who joined Ingvar's expedition. This unusual number suggests the venture was substantial, well-known, and catastrophic. Most participants never returned. Later sagas claim Ingvar reached Sörkland and fought there, achieving victories before disease decimated his force. The historical accuracy of these accounts remains uncertain, but the runestone evidence confirms that a major Swedish expedition penetrated deep into eastern territories in the mid-11th century and suffered terrible losses. These eastern connections shaped Swedish society in profound ways. The silver flowing from Islamic lands funded Swedish state formation. Chieftains used imported wealth to reward followers, build fortifications, and sponsor religious institutions. Churches and monasteries required resources to construct and maintain. Royal power depended on controlling wealth distribution. The eastern trade routes provided a foundation of prosperity that enabled political consolidation. As the Viking Age waned in the 11th century, this eastern silver became increasingly important since Western raiding opportunities were declining. Christian kingdoms in Western Europe had organised effective defences. the days of easy plunder were ending. Sweden's internal political consolidation accelerated during the 11th and 12th centuries. Regional kingdoms merged through conquest, marriage, and negotiation. The Svea and Götar, long distinct groups, gradually united under a single monarchy. This process involved violence. Civil wars erupted when rival claimants disputed succession. Powerful families struggled for dominance. The church inserted itself into political conflicts, supporting candidates who promised to advance Christian interests. Slowly, fitfully, a recognizable Swedish state emerged. The establishment of an archbishopric at Uppsala in 1164 marked a symbolic victory for Christianity over paganism. Uppsala had been the ceremonial centre of Norse religion. Now it became the seat of Swedish ecclesiastical authority. The pagan temple was destroyed, replaced by a Christian cathedral. Archbishop Stefan, the first to hold the office, brought Swedish church organisation under papal authority, integrating Sweden into European Christendom's institutional framework. This development had political consequences. The church provided literate administrators, legal expertise, and ideological justification for royal power. Kings who enjoyed ecclesiastical support found governance easier than those who faced church opposition. The transition from Viking Age warrior culture to medieval Christian kingdom required fundamental changes. Raiding, the traditional path to wealth and honour for young Swedish men, became increasingly difficult and morally questionable. The church condemned piracy and violence against Christians. Economic opportunities had to be found elsewhere. Some Swedes continued seeking fortune in foreign military service. Others intensified participation in peaceful trade. Still others turned attention to opportunities closer to home, conquest and colonization of territories on the Baltic's eastern shore. Swedish expansion into Finland began during the Viking Age, but intensified in the 12th and 13th centuries. Finland offered land, resources, and souls for conversion. Swedish kings justified expansion as crusading activity, bringing Christianity to pagans. The reality proved messier. Finnish tribes resisted conquest. The terrain, dense forests, numerous lakes, harsh winters, challenged military operations. Nevertheless, Swedish control gradually extended. Trading posts became fortified strongholds. Missionaries followed soldiers. Finnish elites who accepted Christianity and Swedish overlordship received privileges. Those who resisted faced military campaigns. The relationship between Sweden and Finland exemplified medieval colonial patterns. Swedish aristocrats received Finnish estates as rewards for service. Swedish law and administrative practices were imposed. The Swedish language became the language of government and commerce. Finnish-speaking populations paid taxes and provided labour. Yet Finns were also integrated into Swedish political structures. Finnish nobles participated in Swedish politics. Finnish bishops attended church councils. The result was a complex hybrid society that would endure for centuries. Trade remained central to Swedish prosperity throughout the medieval period. The Hanseatic League, a powerful network of German trading cities, came to dominate Baltic commerce in the 13th century. Hanseatic merchants established major operations in Swedish cities, particularly Visby on Gotland and later Stockholm. They brought German goods, capital, and commercial expertise. They exported Swedish iron, copper, and timber. This relationship benefited both parties but created dependencies. Swedish kings needed Hanseatic commercial connections and credit. The League needed Swedish resources and market access. Conflicts occasionally erupted, but mutual interest generally prevailed. Stockholm emerged as Sweden's capital during the 13th century. Founded around 1250 by Birger Jarl, a powerful regent, Stockholm occupied a strategic location where Lake Mälaren met the Baltic Sea. The site offered natural defences and controlled critical trade routes. Stockholm grew rapidly, attracting merchants, craftsmen and administrators. By 1300, it had eclipsed earlier centres like Uppsala and Sigtuna. The city's emergence reflected broader changes. Sweden was becoming a more centralised, urban and commercially sophisticated society. The royal dynasty founded by Birger Jarl's son Valdemar governed Sweden during the late 13th century. This period witnessed important legal and administrative developments. Magnus Ladulås, who ruled from 1275 to 1290, exempted the nobility from taxes in exchange for military service, creating a formal aristocratic class with defined privileges. This innovation strengthened royal power by ensuring military support while establishing clear social hierarchies. The peasantry, though free compared to serfs in much of Europe, bore increased tax burdens. Swedish society was stratifying into distinct classes, with different rights, obligations, and opportunities. Yet Sweden remained a poor kingdom by European standards. Population density was low. Agricultural productivity lagged behind southern lands. Winters were long and harsh. Resources were abundant but dispersed across vast territories. These limitations shaped Swedish history. The kingdom could not support large standing armies. Military ventures required careful planning and adequate financing. Ambitious foreign policies exceeded available resources. Sweden's geographical position, on Europe's periphery, bordering the relatively empty lands of the Baltic and Arctic, reduced immediate external threats, but also limited political influence. The 14th century brought crisis. The Black Death arrived in 1350, killing perhaps a third of Sweden's population. Villages were abandoned. Agricultural production collapsed. Tax revenues declined. Labour shortages drove up wages for survivors. The epidemic's social and economic effects lasted generations. Meanwhile, political instability increased. The Folkung dynasty, which had ruled since the 13th century, produced weak kings and contested successions. Powerful noble families struggled for dominance. Denmark and Norway, Sweden's Scandinavian neighbours, intervened in Swedish politics, supporting rival claimants and seeking advantage. In 1397, Sweden entered the Kalmar Union, a political arrangement that united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single monarch. Queen Margaret of Denmark engineered this union through skillful diplomacy, arranged marriages, and military pressure. The union promised benefits, combined strength against external threats, particularly the Hanseatic League and German princes, coordinated trade policies, shared defence costs. Swedish aristocrats who supported the union received privileges and positions. Yet the arrangement generated tensions. Power concentrated in Denmark, the wealthiest and most populous kingdom. Swedish nobles resented Danish dominance. Conflicts over taxation, appointments, and policy erupted regularly. The Kalmar Union endured, with interruptions, until 1523. This period witnessed recurring conflicts between Swedish nationalists seeking independence and pro-union factions accepting Danish leadership. The pattern repeated. Swedish rebels would rise, citing Danish tyranny and excessive taxation. Danish kings would suppress rebellions militarily. Compromises would be negotiated. Resentments would fester. new rebellions would erupt. The union proved unstable because it lacked institutional mechanisms for addressing Swedish grievances, and because Danish kings pursued policies that benefited Denmark at Sweden's expense. The most dramatic conflict occurred during the early 16th century. Christian II, King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, attempted to consolidate control through military force. He captured Stockholm in 1520 after a lengthy siege. What followed became known as the Stockholm Bloodbath. Christian invited Swedish nobles to a reconciliation banquet, then arrested and executed approximately 80 to 100 of them, including bishops and prominent aristocrats. The executions were technically legal. The victims were tried for heresy, but everyone understood this as political elimination of Danish opposition. The Stockholm bloodbath proved a catastrophic miscalculation. Rather than intimidating Swedish resistance, it ignited widespread rebellion. Gustav Vasa, a young nobleman whose father had been executed, escaped and fled to Dalarna in northern Sweden. There he rallied miners and peasants, building a rebel army. His message was simple. Christian II was a tyrant and murderer. Denmark sought to enslave Sweden. Swedes must fight for freedom and revenge. The appeal worked. Within months, Gustav commanded a substantial force. By 1521, he controlled most of Sweden. In 1523, he captured Stockholm and was elected King of Sweden, ending the Kalmar Union. Gustav Vasa's reign from 1523 to 1560 transformed Sweden. He found a bankrupt kingdom exhausted by decades of warfare. He left a consolidated state with functioning administration, solvent finances, and growing international influence. How did he accomplish this? Through ruthless pragmatism, administrative innovation, and opportunistic exploitation of the Protestant Reformation. Gustav understood that effective governance required resources, loyalty, and institutional capacity. He set about acquiring all three. The Protestant Reformation provided opportunity. When Martin Luther's ideas spread to Sweden in the 1520s, Gustav saw possibilities beyond theology. The Catholic Church owned approximately 21% of Swedish land and collected substantial tithes. If Sweden broke with Rome and established a national church, the crown could confiscate these assets. Gustav proceeded cautiously, sensing resistance from conservative nobles and peasants attached to traditional religion. By 1527, he felt strong enough to act. At the Diet of Västerås, he threatened abdication unless granted church properties. The assembled nobles and clergy, faced with losing their king and potential chaos, capitulated. Sweden became Lutheran. Gustav seized church lands, melted down church treasures, and redirected ecclesiastical revenues to the crown. This confiscation provided resources for state building. Gustav paid off foreign debts, built fortifications, organised a navy, and created administrative structures. He established regional bailiffs who collected taxes, enforced laws, and reported directly to the king. He conducted comprehensive land surveys, documenting ownership and taxation obligations. He promoted mining, particularly at Falun, where copper production generated substantial revenue. Swedish copper became a major export commodity, providing hard currency for imports and diplomacy. Gustav's reign represented Sweden's transition from medieval confederation to early modern, centralized state. Yet Gustav's methods generated opposition. His high taxes burdened peasants. His centralization threatened noble privileges. His religious policies offended Catholics and conservative Lutherans alike. Rebellions erupted repeatedly, requiring military suppression. The Daka Rebellion of 1542 to 1543 in Smolensk proved particularly serious. Niels Daka, a peasant leader, organised armed resistance against Gustav's taxation and religious policies. Daka's forces controlled substantial territory and won several battles before royal armies crushed the rebellion. Gustav responded with harsh reprisals, executing leaders and imposing additional taxes as punishment. The message was clear: resistance meant death and ruin. Gustav established hereditary monarchy, breaking with Sweden's elective tradition. Previously, each new king required election and confirmation by nobles and important townsmen. Gustav wanted his dynasty secured. In 1544, the Riksdag, Parliament, declared the throne hereditary in the Vasa line. This decision fundamentally altered Swedish politics. It reduced noble influence over succession. It created clearer lines of authority. It aligned Sweden with European monarchical norms. Yet it also generated long-term problems when Vasa kings proved incompetent or insane, since removing them became constitutionally difficult. Gustav's sons inherited his ambitions, but not always his ability. Erik XV, who ruled from 1560 to 1568, possessed intelligence and energy, but also paranoia and instability. He murdered nobles he suspected of treason. He instituted bizarre policies. He pursued grandiose foreign policy schemes Sweden could not afford. His brothers, led by Johan, eventually deposed him, imprisoning Erik in various castles until he died in 1577, possibly poisoned. Johan III ruled from 1568 to 1592, pursuing more cautious policies. He promoted trade, patronised arts and architecture, and maintained relatively peaceful relations with neighbours. Yet he also married a Catholic Polish princess and showed sympathy toward Catholicism, alarming Sweden's Lutheran establishment. The succession crisis following Johan's death nearly destroyed the Vasa dynasty. Johan's son, Sigismund, had been elected King of Poland in 1587, making him ruler of both Sweden and Poland after his father's death in 1592. But Sigismund was Catholic, educated by Jesuits, and committed to counter-Reformation principles. Swedish Lutherans feared he would restore Catholicism. Sigismund's uncle Karl, Johan III's brother, led opposition. Civil war erupted. Karl defeated Sigismund's forces at the Battle of Stongebro in 1598. Sigismund returned to Poland, never regaining Sweden. Karl ruled as regent, then as King Karl IX, from 1604 to 1611, though his legitimacy remained contested. This succession struggle had religious, political, and geopolitical dimensions. Religious conflicts between Lutheran Sweden and Catholic Poland intensified. Political struggles between monarchy and nobility escalated as Karl suppressed opposition ruthlessly. Geopolitically, Sweden's and Poland's union under Sigismund would have created a powerful Baltic empire. That possibility's collapse set Sweden and Poland on collision course. The 17th century would witness devastating wars between them as they competed for Baltic dominance. Karl IX's reign, though successful in securing Lutheran succession, ended badly. He launched disastrous wars against Denmark, Russia, and Poland simultaneously. Swedish armies suffered defeats. Resources were strained. When Karl died in 1611, he left his teenage son Gustavus Adolphus facing multiple enemies, empty treasuries, and doubtful prospects. Yet Gustavus Adolphus would become Sweden's greatest king, transforming the kingdom into a major European power. His reign represented the apex of Swedish Viking martial heritage adapted to early modern warfare. The combination of aggressive expansion, military innovation, and calculated risks that characterised Swedish history from the Viking Age through the imperial period. The legacy of the Swedish Vikings shaped this development profoundly. The eastward orientation, the reliance on trade and plunder, the integration of foreign peoples and territories, the pragmatic mixing of commerce and violence, all these patterns established during the Viking Age persisted in modified forms. When Gustavus Adolphus conquered territories around the Baltic, he followed routes Swedish traders had pioneered centuries earlier. When Swedish administrators governed Baltic provinces, they employed techniques developed ruling Finland. When Swedish merchants traded with Russia, they built on networks established by the Rus. The Viking Age ended, but its influence endured. The transformation of the Rus in Kievan Rus represents the Swedish Vikings' most significant legacy. The state that emerged from Swedish trading ventures became Russia, one of history's great empires. The Rus dynasty ruled until 1598. Russian language, culture, and identity developed through centuries of evolution, absorbing influences from Byzantium, the steppe nomads, and Western Europe. By the time the dynasty ended, few Russians remembered or cared about Scandinavian origins. Yet those origins mattered. Without Swedish Vikings, the political development of Eastern Europe would have followed different trajectories. The cities they founded, Novgorod, Kiev, others, became enduring centres of power and culture. The Swedish Vikings differed from their Danish and Norwegian cousins in fundamental ways. They built less through conquest than commerce, less through settlement than integration. They adapted more readily to local conditions, intermarrying and adopting local languages and customs. Their legacy proves less visible in dramatic sagas of kings and battles, more evident in trade routes, city foundations, and cultural exchanges. They were merchants as much as warriors, diplomats as much as raiders. This flexibility enabled extraordinary achievements. From Baltic fishing villages, they reached Baghdad and Constantinople. They established dynasties in foreign lands. They channeled wealth and ideas between civilizations. Yet we should not romanticize them. They enslaved thousands, selling human beings like any other commodity. They killed when it served their interests. They exploited weaker populations ruthlessly. The trading stations they established existed through intimidation and violence as much as mutual benefit. The silver they accumulated came from suffering, furs from trappers working in brutal conditions, slaves torn from families, tribute extorted from conquered peoples. Their achievements built on others' misery. The Viking Age ended not through moral awakening, but change in circumstances. Christian kingdoms organised effective defences. Trade became more profitable than raiding. Political consolidation required different skills than plundering. The men who had sought fortune in eastern rivers now sought it in Baltic commerce or royal service. Society needed administrators, not adventurers. The values that had sent young men rowing up Russian rivers, ambition, courage, disregard for conventional limitations, found new outlets in state building, commercial enterprise, and eventually imperial expansion. What remains of the Swedish Vikings? Runestones scattered across the landscape, commemorating journeys and deaths. Hoards of Arabic silver, buried and never retrieved. Place names in Russia preserving Scandinavian origins. Genetic traces in modern populations. And less tangibly, cultural patterns and historical trajectories shaped by their activities. Russia's Western orientation toward Europe owes something to those early Swedish traders who connected Baltic and Black Seas. Swedish maritime traditions trace back to Viking shipbuilding, the integration of diverse territories and populations that characterized both Kievan Rus and the Swedish Empire reflected lessons learned during the Viking Age. The Swedish Vikings remind us that history rarely follows tidy narratives. They were not purely noble explorers or villainous raiders. They were humans pursuing opportunity through available means, sometimes admirable, often brutal, always pragmatic. They succeeded brilliantly at their self-assigned task, acquiring wealth and power in a competitive world. That success transformed them and those they encountered. Swedish farmers' sons became Rus princes. Slavic tribes became the Russian people. Trade routes became kingdoms. Seasonal expeditions became permanent settlements. Nothing about these transformations was inevitable. They resulted from countless individual decisions, lucky accidents, and unintended consequences. Understanding the Swedish Vikings requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. They were merchants and warriors, builders and destroyers, integrators and exploiters. They followed patterns established in their Scandinavian homeland while adapting to radically different environments. They remained recognizably Swedish while becoming something else entirely. This complexity makes their history rich and significant. They demonstrate human capacity for cultural flexibility, for long-distance coordination, for sustained effort toward distant goals. They also demonstrate human capacity for violence, greed, and indifference to others' suffering. The rivers they travelled still flow. The cities they founded still stand. The languages they influenced still are spoken. The genes they contributed still persist in modern populations. Yet the world they inhabited has vanished utterly. We cannot understand their motivations through modern categories. A Swedish trader heading down the Dnieper in 950 operated with different assumptions, values, and worldviews than we possess. He believed in gods we consider mythological. He practiced slavery we consider abhorrent. He risked death for wealth we would consider modest. Yet his human emotions, ambition, fear, love, anger, we recognize. His desire for prosperity, for status, for adventure resonates across centuries. In that tension between radical difference and fundamental similarity lies the fascination of history. The Swedish Vikings carved their story into runestones, wrote it in silver hoards, built it in cities that outlasted their creators. They journeyed farther than most contemporaries imagined possible, endured hardships we can barely conceive, and achieved transformations they never anticipated. From Baltic shores to Byzantine palaces, from Scandinavian farms to Russian principalities, they demonstrated what humans can accomplish when ambition meets opportunity. Their legacy endures not in the form they would recognize. No one worships Odin at Uppsala anymore. No Swedish prince rules Kiev, but in the deeper patterns they established. The connections they forged between Northern and Eastern Europe, the trade routes they pioneered, the cultural exchanges they facilitated, the states they helped create. These shaped European history profoundly. In the end, the Swedish Vikings represent a particular human response to particular circumstances. Given their geography, their resources, their neighbours, and their moment in history, they developed specific strategies for survival and prosperity. Those strategies worked spectacularly for several centuries. Then circumstances changed. The Viking Age ended, but the changes wrought endured. Russia exists because Swedish Vikings travelled east. Baltic trade networks persisted because they established foundations. Swedish history followed trajectories their voyages initiated. They were not inevitable, not predetermined, not fulfilling some grand destiny. They were simply people, ambitious, capable, ruthless, adaptive people, making choices that echoed across centuries. That is their legacy. A reminder that human actions, however contingent and local, can ripple through time in ways their authors never imagined, shaping futures they would not recognize as their own.